So we left the goat with the person that brought it out into the wilderness. We left them 12 mil, 24,000 amot outside Jerusalem, and the goat had been thrown off the cliff, and we noticed that the person that took the goat had to wash his clothes and bathe before coming back into Jerusalem. There was a dispute as to whether he needed to do this, whether his clothes became unclean the minute he left the city walls, or whether they only became unclean when he pushed the goat off the cliff. But that was where that's where we left the process. And now we're going to come back into the center of the temple. In order to understand what the Mishnah is doing, we actually need to revisit the Pesukim. So if you don't mind, before we jump into the Mishnah, we're towards the end of chapter 6. We're going to jump in at the 7th Mishnah of chapter 6. But before we jump into the Mishnah, we're just going to check back on the Pesukim, just to see how this sequence works, at least as it's described in Tanakh. And then once we see how it's described in Tanakh, we'll understand a little bit better as to what the Mishnah is trying to achieve. The goat shall bear all their iniquities, El Eretz Gezerah, to a land which is cut off. And then he lets the goat go into the wilderness. And then after that happens, only after that happens, does Aaron come back in the tent. Uva Aaron and Ohel Moed. Aaron then comes back in the sanctuary. And he takes off his linen garments and he leaves them there and he bathes. And then he's going to put on his regular gold garments. And then the Torah says, Ve'asa et olato ve'et olat ha'am. And then he's going to offer his burnt offering and the burnt offering of the people. And then he'll make atonement for himself and for the people. And the fat of the sin offering will burn on the altar. So that those are the Pesukim, if you like. After the goat is sent, he can change his clothes and bathe and then offer the offerings. So, and the Pesukim carry on to say, by the way, that after they're offered, ve'et parachatat ve'et seir hachatat asher huva et damam lechaper b'kodesh yotzi el michutz lamachane. So he takes the bull of the sin offering and the goat of the sin offering, and their hide, the parts that aren't the sacrificial parts, the external parts, are taken outside the sanctuary to be burnt. They're burnt outside, just like the goat is taken outside. And the person that burns them has to wash his clothes and bathe his flesh in water, just like the person that brought the goat out into the wilderness. So there's a parallel, if you like, between the goat, the goat in the wilderness, and the bull and the goat of the sin offering. And they're both taken outside the camp, and the person that takes them out becomes tameh. He has to wash before he comes back in. So that's the situation in those are the verses in the Chumash. So now let's have a look at the Mishnah now. We're in the 7th Mishnah of chapter 6. Balo etzel par v'sa'ir hanisrafin. He came to the bull and the goat that were to be burned. So these are the sin offerings that are going to have to be taken outside the camp. Kara'an v'hotzi et amurehem. He cuts them open. He takes out the sacrificial portions. There are some portions which need to be burnt on the altar. Nitanan ba'mages. He puts them on a tray. V'hiktiran al gabei mizbeach, and then he burns them on the altar. And then the other parts, kla'an b'miklaot, he twists them round a carrying poles. V'hotzian leveita srefa. The other parts are twisted around carrying poles and taken out to the place of burning. And the Mishnah then asks, Ume'ematai matamin begadim. From when are his clothes unclean? It's a parallel question to the question that we asked at the end of Mishnah, at the end of the sixth Mishnah. At the end of the sixth Mishnah, we talked about the person who'd taken the goat out to the tzuk, to push off the cliff. And we asked, Ume'ematai mtame begadim. From when are his clothes unclean? And we're asking exactly the same question here about the person that brings out the remnants of the sacrifice of the sin offerings to be burned. Ume'ematai mtamin begadim. And there's exactly the same dispute as we had in the previous Mishnah. Misha yetzu chutz l'choma ha'azara. After they've gone outside the walls of the temple courtyard. The parallel statement in the previous Mishnah was as soon as they've left the city of Jerusalem. And then, just as in the parallel Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon is going to come and disagree. Rabbi Shimon Omer, mi sheyitzat ha'ur berubam. Rabbi Shimon says, from the moment that the fire has taken hold of most of them. In other words, just as he holds that the person who takes the goat away becomes tameh as soon as the goat is pushed off the cliff. He holds that the person who takes the sin offerings away becomes tameh as soon as the fire has taken hold of them. There's some kind of parallelism between these two processes, between burning the sin offerings and pushing the goat off the cliff. And then the Mishnah explains, Amru lo Kohen Gadol, Higia Sa'ir Lamidbar. They say to the Kohen Gadol, the goat has reached the wilderness. And we must be backtracking here, because the order of the Pesukim makes clear that the Kohen Gadol can't go on and carry out all these other operations until he sent the goat out. So we need to know when the goats reach the wilderness. And how do they know? Uminayin hayodim, the Mishnah asks. Well, how do they know where this goat is? Minayin hayodim shehigia sa'ir lamidbar. How do they know that the goat had reached the wilderness? And there are two answers. The first answer is that they would set up some kind of systems of scouts. Dar kiot hayuosin. They used to set up things called dar kiot. Now, dar kiot clearly come from the root of derech, which is wayside. And it's commonly translated as scouts. So maybe these dar kiot are humans. The Rambam actually says these are sort of watchtowers. He says matzevot. They're places where the scouts used to stand. So they set up high towers the scouts used to stand on. And this, by the way, intuitively it makes it more sense. And of course, the Rambam in his commentary on the Mishnah is normally pretty reliable on issues to do with linguistics. So I've given you both. I've given you the scouts on the source sheet and in brackets, the watchtowers. Anyway, they used to set up these scouts or these watchtowers, umani fin basudarin, and they'd wave scarves. So they have some kind of visual signal from scout to scout, or from scout standing on the watchtower to the next scout standing on the watchtower. So we already learned when we looked at the previous Mishnah that when the man with the goat is accompanied right to the last station, and at the last station they let him go on alone, he goes on for the last 4,000 amot, but they're looking after him to see what he's doing. And each station is only 2,000 amot apart. So it's about 1,000 amot is 2,000 amot is about 1,000 yards. So it's a kilometer. It's less than a mile. It's less than a mile. So on a clear day, as long as there's no hill in between, you can see from station to station. So they'd set up these waving stations, and they'd know that the goat had reached the wilderness. Now, and Rabbi Yehuda will disagree here, actually. Amar Rabbi Yehuda v'halo siman gadol hayalahem. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we don't need to do all this stuff. We can just measure with time. And Rabbi Yehuda, by the way, is a little bit like Rabbi Shimon. He thinks that the job has been done as soon as the goat has effectively reached the beginning of the wilderness. So he doesn't want to count the full 12 mil. He only wants to count 3 mil. And he can estimate that in time. And he's going to explain how. Amar Rav Yehuda v'halo siman gadol hayalahem. Rabbi Yehuda said, didn't they have a great sign? Mirushalayim v'yad Beit Chidudo. From Jerusalem to Beit Chidudo. And this seems to be the beginning of the desert. And it's actually spelled differently in Kaufman, and the Rambam has a different spelling. The Rambam says Kaufman says Haroron, and the Rambam says Haron. The Daled goes to a resh, and there's a nun at the end. It's some place anyway, at the beginning of the wilderness, whether it's Chidudo with Daleds or Haroron with reshes. Mirushalayim v'yad Beit Chidudo shlosha milim. So there were 3 mills. Holchim mil, so they could walk a mil. These are the people that are accompanying the goat, accompanying the man with the goats. They can walk out a mil. Ve chosrin mil, and they can then return a mil. So now they've walked 2 mills. Ve shohin kadei mil, and they wait the time it takes to walk a mil. And thus they know that the goat has reached the wilderness. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, they would just calculate effectively. And by the way, the halacha doesn't go according to Rabbi Yehuda, but it's interesting to know that the Mishnah, at any rate, seems to remember these 2 ways of doing things. And the Gemara remembers a 3rd way, which does not appear in good manuscripts of the Mishnah. So I put it in square brackets for you here. Rabbi Yishmael says, didn't they have a different sign? Rabbi Yishmael omer halo siman acher hayalahem. So Rabbi Yishmael's got a completely different memory that is not in the Kaufman manuscript, but it seems to have crept into the Mishnah, at least into the printed editions from the Gemara. So what's his different sign? Lashon shel Zohorit haya kashur al pitcho shel heichal. So a thread of crimson wool was tied to the door of the temple. And when the goat reached the wilderness, the thread turned white. Shenemar, we know this pasuk. Imiyu chatechem kashanim kasheleg yalbinu. If your sins be as scarlet, they shall end up as white as snow. And it seems as if Rabbi Yehuda is remembering a time before the time when they used to tie the crimson cord to the horns of the goat. This seems to be the same crimson cord, right, which we heard as being tied to the horns of the goat, and it's then cut in half before the goat's pushed off of the cliff. Half of it goes down the cliff, and half is tied to a rock. And in the memory of Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yishmael was alive in the time of the temple. In the memory of Rabbi Yishmael, this cord was actually, it never went to the wilderness with the goat. It was actually kept, and it was tied to the doors of the temple. And then when people saw that it had turned white, they knew that the goat had reached the desert and had been pushed off, and that the people were forgiven.